first became aware of Captain George Ward Cole when I came across this S.T. Gill picture in the State Library collection. It shows immigrants disembarking from the paddle steamer Gypsy on Queen's Wharf, Melbourne in the mid-1850s, with a mysterious-looking Cole's Wharf in the background. But my curiosity was aroused when I read the most remarkable letter written by the then ex-governor, Charles Joseph Latrobe, to Captain Cole following the death of Captain Ferguson in 1868. Captain Ferguson was the harbour master of the port of Melbourne, and previously the captain of the bark Raja. What was the story behind Cole's Wharf, and who was this Captain Cole to whom Latrobe wrote, entrusting him with ensuring that Captain Ferguson's widow was looked after? It turned out that Captain Cole was a war hero, an entrepreneur, a respected politician, and was a big influence on Port Phillip life from 1840 for 40 years. But first, the story of Cole's Wharf. When Captain Cole came to Melbourne in 1840, he, like nearly all people arriving in those days, arrived by sea. In this 1864 chart of Hobson's Bay and the Yarra, you can see that there is deep water near the shore where Station Pier is today. This line shows the 18-foot depth contour. So the larger ships anchored here, and cargo and passengers had to come ashore in small boats. They had two choices: to follow the 8.5-mile long, narrow, winding Yarra to Melbourne, where they had to scramble ashore on a muddy bank, or a shorter journey to the beach at Sandwich, where refreshments and rest could be obtained at the Ides Pier Hotel, before a carriage to the Yarra Punt and across to Melbourne. These three pictures were painted by Wilbraham Frederick Evelyn Liarday, and in the audience today we have a descendant of Liarday, Dot O'Connell. Welcome, Dot, and partner Rex. They brought copies of these pictures, and they're available on the table at the back there for you to have a look at in detail. They're fascinating pictures. There were many proposals to improve access to the city. Even before Latrobe arrived in 1839, Hoddle proposed a railway from the beach to the city. And in 1854, the first railway in Australia started operating on the route. This is the train entering Flinders Street Station. Others proposed canals to improve ship access to the city, cutting across directly from the deep-water anchorage, or cutting off the long bend of the river. Captain Cole proposed this idea. It was not until 1886 that the Coode Canal opened, following much the course of this proposal. This is the river today. Back in the 1840s, Captain Cole saw that a wharf was badly needed to service the developing city. Private enterprise had worked well in Sydney to develop the port infrastructure when government funds were lacking. Legislation allowed private wharfs to charge a wharfage fee to pay for the building and maintenance of the wharf. In 1841, Captain Cole applied to Latrobe to build the first private wharf on the Yarra. He bought just over an acre of land on the north bank between Spencer and King Street for £1,000 per acre at auction. A bit of a contrast from the £20 an acre Latrobe had paid the year before for the land which became his Jolly Mont estate. But it was river frontage, which Cole described as a tea tree swamp at high tides covered with water. You can see the land marked here. Cole spent around £60,000 in constructing the wharf. He said, "I was encouraged to make a dock and also formed a wharf with a good platform on which goods could be landed in safety. And I also built a wall 9 feet high all around, as required by the government." This shows the shape of the wharf and the buildings on the site. You can see the dock cut into the centre of the section near the river. So by 1842, he was running a successful operation, landing goods from his own ships and those of other ship owners. Although other private wharfs started to be built, the government's Queen's Wharf remained very primitive, with vessels tied up to stumps and stakes along the bank, and where raised walkways and planks were used to access the settlement through the swamp. He also built a bomb store north of Flinders Street between King and William Streets. In this picture from the 1950s, this is where the wharf would have been, with Queen's Wharf to the right looking pretty derelict. And the bond store was still there. This picture was taken in 1969. You can still see Cole's Bond written on the wall, the newer overpainting having flaked off. This shows the store being demolished in 1972. When building the wharf, Captain Cole had not counted on the government moving the goalposts. In 1843, the government ordered wharf owners to give a third of their wharfage fees to the government. Then came separation, and the new colony government required Cole to buy a 12-month licence to be able to continue to charge wharfage fees. 9 months into the licence period, the government abolished wharfage fees altogether. This in the middle of the gold rush, when Cole could have expected the wharf to do well. Cole appealed to Latrobe for compensation for the loss of earnings for the remaining 3 months of his licence and was awarded £3,469. The final indignity came in 1854 when the government imposed a wharfage rate on all goods landed in order to fund their own wharf building. They did not allow the private owners to keep any of the fee to fund their own wharfs. So Cole had the injustice of having to pay wharfage fees on his own goods landed on his own wharf to fund the government works with no income to fund his own. Cole conducted a long campaign for compensation, or for the government to buy the wharf. And it was not until 1868 that the government bought his wharf for £19,000, a fraction of what the wharf had cost to construct, and the lost income due to the government's changing the rules. This picture from 1858 shows Queen's Wharf on the right and Cole's Wharf in the centre. You can see the falls in front of the pedal steamer on the left. The falls were a key reason why Melbourne was sited on this spot. Upstream of the falls is fresh water, and downstream is deep enough water for medium-sized boats and room to tire and turn. But what of Cole before he arrived in Melbourne? John and Eliza Cole gave birth to their fourth son, George Ward, in November 1793 at Lumley Castle in Durham, where John worked. At the age of 14, he joined the Navy as a volunteer. His first ship was HMS Lark, a sloop of war of 18 guns on the Jamaica station, and he soon obtained the rating of midshipman. This was in the middle of the Napoleonic War. The Royal Navy was tasked to capture French overseas territories to stop privateers based there, so enabling Britain to reduce her forces in the area. The HMS Lark formed part of the British naval and military force to support the Spanish in an attempt to retake Santo Domingo from the French. After an 8-month campaign, the Spanish and British force captured the city in July 1809. Soon afterwards, Cole was transferred to the Lark, so from the Lark to the schooner Fleur de la Mer, which had been badly damaged in a hurricane. The day after his transfer, the Lark was hit by the hurricane and was lost, with only 3 men being saved. Cole made his way back to England and served in ships in the Downs and the Baltic before joining HMS Tonnant, 80 guns, fitting out as the flagship of Sir Alexander Cochrane, and on its way to Bermuda for the 1814 campaign against the United States. By this time, Napoleon had abdicated, but the United States had declared war on Britain over neutral trading rights. The Royal Navy was blockading the North American coast, and Cochrane was returning to continue action in Chesapeake Bay. He planned to attack Washington by moving troops up the Patchison River from the base at Tangier Island. Cole was attached to a launch which helped convey soldiers up the river, dropping them off at Benedict before continuing up the river to take the Marine Artillery ashore to be dragged overland by the seamen. Although Cole was wounded in the leg, he marched with the guns overnight and joined the army at the Battle of Blankenburg. The British won the battle and continued overnight to Washington, where they destroyed the city, setting fire to the White House. In part a payback for the American destruction of Port Dover in Canada. The British retreated and headed north to Baltimore, where they attempted to take Fort McHenry. Cole again was employed in a launch landing troops, then moved to a bomb vessel that kept up continual fire on the fort. Cole got too near a 13-inch mortar and lost the use of his left ear. However, the defences held and the British were pushed back. The Tonnant sailed to New Orleans, where a British force planned to take the city. In case you're getting geographically challenged, this map shows Santo Domingo on what is now the Dominican Republic, Washington and Baltimore, and New Orleans on the mouth of the Mississippi. Cole was second in command of a launch with an 18-pounder in the bow and 32 men. As part of a squadron of boats, they pursued 5 American gunboats seen here in blue, and after rowing for 36 hours, they captured them. This little animation I found on the web, which shows the action. Cole's boat was hit and filled with water. Nevertheless, his was the 3rd boat alongside and took part in the boarding. Cole was slightly wounded in the shoulder, and Cochrane promoted him to acting lieutenant and put him in command of one of the captured gunboats. Cole used his boat to convey troops to the shore to attack New Orleans, but poor tactics by the superior British force led them to be taken off again. During the evacuation, 2 soldiers fell into the sea, and Cole leapt overboard and succeeded in saving one of them. During this campaign, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, ending the war with America. Incidentally, a young Lieutenant John Franklin was also in the battle for New Orleans, commanding one of the boats that attacked and captured the American gunboats. I've not found any record of Cole and Franklin meeting, but they must have met when Sir John Franklin visited Melbourne in 1843, on his way back to England, having been recalled as Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land. Cole was a prominent citizen in Melbourne at the time, well connected, and his war record was well known. Back in England, Cole's promotion to lieutenant was confirmed, and he joined HMS Primrose, 18 guns, and sailed back to Jamaica. On the voyage, he again saved a life by jumping into the sea after a sail. He was made first lieutenant, and having moved to HMS Peak, 32 guns, he jumped into the sea for the 3rd time to sail. Peace having broken out, ships were decommissioned and men paid off. Cole was placed on half pay in October 1817. He was promoted to commander in December, but did not sail again with the Navy. Cole had had an outstanding naval career. In just 10 years, and age only 24, he had proved himself resourceful in action and was well on the way to post-captain and then admiral. But peace had intervened. Like many naval officers at this time, he entered into the mercantile marine service. At times he commanded vessels, some of which he owned, and engaged in many types of enterprise, such as fur trading in the north, on the coast of America, pearl fishing in the Society Islands, sandalwood trade in the New Hebrides, whaling, at times based in Sydney, where he also purchased land. He managed to find time during his travels to marry Eliza Corty in 1824. She had been married twice before and brought 2 sons and a daughter to the marriage. They had a son, Ward Luke, in 1825. Unfortunately, Eliza died in Singapore 2 years later. After many years of travel and adventure, Captain Cole was probably looking to put down some roots. He would have heard that there were opportunities in Melbourne, as it was in the very early stages of settlement. So he decided to move there, arriving on the 4th of July 1840 in his schooner Waterlily, with his son and 2 stepsons. At 47, he was much older than the others in Melbourne at the time. Latrobe was 39, Lonsdale 40, and Faulkner 37. So it is not surprising that he was called Old King Cole, especially in his later years when he kept his white hair long and unruly. He could see that Melbourne needed steamships to move passengers and cargo from Hobson's Bay and across the bay to Geelong. He became a director of the Port Phillip Steam Navigation Company, which operated the paddle steamer Fraser twice a week to Geelong. It was in this ship that Latrobe used to visit his house in Shortlands Bluff. And also the Seahorse twice a month to Sydney, the Corsair twice a week to Launceston, and the Governor Arthur twice daily to Williamstown. In 1851, he built the city of Melbourne, the first screw steamer built south of the equator, which commenced the first regular steam ferry service across Bass Strait. And of course he built Cole's Wharf. Captain Cole was in the forefront of a revolution in sea transportation. Although he had grown up with sailing ships, he could see that steam propulsion was the way of the future. As an illustration of the contrast, when Bishop Broughton, the Bishop of Australia, left Melbourne in 1843 to return to Sydney, he booked a passage on the bark Midlothian. He spent 3 days on the ship while it attempted to sail through the Heads. On the third day, the paddle steamer Shamrock came into view, heading for Sydney via Launceston. Bishop Broughton transferred to the Shamrock, and by nightfall, it was 2/3 of the way to Launceston. Sailing ships had traditionally arrived at a port and then advertised for cargo and passengers, departing whenever a load was available and the weather favourable. But steamships would run to a schedule, enabling people to book cargo and passage ahead of the ship's arrival. The first ships to be fitted with steam engines used paddle wheels like the Shamrock. Their manoeuvrability made them very useful in rivers and harbours, but in open water, the rolling of the ship could expose the paddles, and the loading of the ship varied the depth of the paddles in the water, reducing efficiency. A screw or propeller always stayed underwater and was not affected by the ship's roll, so they were quickly developed and took over from paddles. Early steam engines were not powerful or reliable enough to be the only means of propulsion, so they were initially used as an auxiliary power source, as in the Shamrock, the sails taking over in open water when the wind was favourable. The key part of putting down roots is finding a wife. Now, as you might expect, suitable marriage material was in short supply in Melbourne at the time. However, he did identify a possible candidate, Thomasina Ann McRae, quaintly known as Thomas Ann, sister-in-law to Georgiana McRae. Unmarried and at 31, she was unlikely to have many more suitors. This picture of her was painted some 6 years earlier in Scotland. It is not known when the picture of Cole was painted, but probably a similar time. He proposed to her in October 1841, causing some consternation in the McRae family. At 17 years older and partly deaf, he did not seem a very inspiring suitor. However, Cole was well-to-do and would be able to offer her a handsome establishment and independence from her brother Farquhar. She sought Georgiana's advice, but Georgiana kept her opinion out of her diary. Farquhar's views, however, were plain, and after a deadly quarrel, Thomas Ann left his household and moved to her sister Margaret's house. Cole went all out to increase his appeal. He bought beachfront land in the new township of Brighton. Perhaps as a thank you for her acceptance of his offer, he gave a picnic party at his Brighton Beach property for 150 guests, including Superintendent Latrobe. He quickly built a house at St Ninians, and the Coles spent their honeymoon there after their marriage in March 1842. Cole had bought his land in Brighton from Henry Dendy. Dendy had taken up the offer to purchase land under the Colonial Office's Special Survey Scheme, devised to promote the development of townships and colonies. Applicants had to purchase 8 square miles for £1 an acre, that is £5,120. Once in the colony, they could select their land. The only restriction was that it must be in one block and be not more than twice as long as broad. When Dendy arrived in Melbourne in 1841, he caused consternation. The order authorised the holder to monopolise the whole suburban area of Melbourne if he liked. Latrobe refused to honour the special survey before he had received advice. After 3 months of negotiation with Latrobe and Governor Gibbs, it was agreed that he could choose land not closer than 5 miles from an existing town and no more than 2 miles of bay frontage. The northern boundary of the land he chose was exactly 5 miles from Melbourne at what is now North Road, Brighton. The land extended 2 miles down to South Road and 4 miles east to Boundary Road. You can now see how these roads got their names. This 1853 map of Port Phillip has Dendy's special survey marked. J.B. Weir became his partner, and an elegant subdivision plan was drawn up by surveyor H.B. Foote. If we look at the plan with north at the top, it doesn't come out very clearly, that does it? You can recognise Foote's off-grid town section, maybe, with its elegant crescents and the beachfront villa blocks to the northwest, with Cole's land at its centre. Dendy was in a position to make a fortune, with his land potentially worth up to £100,000. However, he did not have a good head for business, and when the Depression hit in 1843, he was outmanoeuvred by Weir and he lost everything. Cole, also hit by the Depression, managed to find a second instalment on his land, but he had to rent out his townhouse in William Street, and he leased St Ninians to William Brickwood for him to receive young gentlemen to board and educate. The government taking a third of his wharfage fees wouldn't have helped his finances. He had to reach an agreement with some of his creditors to avoid bankruptcy, but in the end he paid them all back in full. He had built a fine house in William Street on the corner of Latrobe Street, opposite the Flagstaff Gardens. This drawing by Edward Latrobe Bateman shows the dormer-windowed house. This is Latrobe Street. William Street is at the back of the house. This photograph was taken in 1869, and it shows the back of the house facing onto William Street. The Flagstaff railway station now takes up the site. When Bishop Broughton came to Melbourne in 1843, Georgiana wrote, "Bishop Broughton stayed at Captain Cole's house, which he has let for the bishop's accommodation, with the servants to attend to him." This was probably while Cole was trying to let the house. Having the bishop staying there would do no harm to its rental prospects. In the meantime, the Coles moved into apartments at Cole's Wharf. It would have been very convenient for Captain Cole, but I wonder what Thomas Ann made of it. At the time of the flood in Melbourne in 1844, Georgiana wrote, "The water in Mrs. Cole's dining room is at the wharf, was up to the top of the table, while she herself looked for refuge in the upper floor of the house." Thomas Ann must have been very relieved when William Brickwood, who had leased St Ninians, was appointed as headmaster of the Port Phillip Academical Institution when it opened in 1844, freeing up St Ninians. Cole's beachfront property in Brighton totaled 25 acres, with a house built near Point Cole. The first building was a 2-storey brick house, seen here in a modern painting of how it looked in Cole's time. This became a servants' wing when a new wing, built out of Indian teak with a long veranda, was added in the 1850s. In front of the house, stretching away from the low veranda, was a croquet lawn with fine trees, shrubs and flowers beyond. In 1854, Edward Latrobe Bateman was working on the garden. His friend Alfred Howitt wrote, "He is now at Brighton, at King Cole's, turning His Majesty's garden upside down and back again, shifting trees, raising gullies, building a bower and levelling hills." In the 1860s, St Ninians hosted the celebrated Brighton Flower Show. In 1863, Governor Sir Charles and Lady Darling visited the Brighton Flower Show at St Ninians and ignored convention by lunching with the Coles, which must have delighted Thomas Ann. Captain Cole rounded off the day by winning prizes for a specimen of Pelargonium and for a peacock in the poultry section. Thomas Ann formed a genuine friendship with Governor Sir Henry Manners Sutton's wife, Georgiana, visiting Government House in Toorak regularly for private meals. The children were of a similar age, visiting each other at Toorak and Brighton. Captain Cole took the girls down to the ship to see off the family when the governor left the colony in 1873. Thomas Ann had a private farewell with Georgiana. There were 8 acres of fruit and vegetables with apples, grapes, peaches, apricots, damsons, plums, almonds, pears, cherries, strawberries, figs and quinces, often given away to visitors. The gardeners carted seaweed to the paddocks and ploughed it in. Cole pioneered the practice in the colony. The house staff in the 60s consisted of cook, needlewoman, house and parlour maid and laundress, but it was difficult to keep servants with 10 new servants in one 4-month period in 1867. This is Captain Cole and family at St Ninians in about 1859. Captain Cole in the centre with Thomas Ann, William on the left, Margaret seated, then Farquhar next to a lady, Agnes is seated on the right. They had lost their other 2 children, George and Elizabeth, and Captain Cole's son Ward Luke from his first marriage. St Ninians survived for many years. After Thomas Ann's death in 1898, the only surviving child, Margaret, could not afford to maintain the house, so she sold it to Tommy Bent. Tommy Bent is seated in top hat in the middle of this picture in the garden of St Ninians. He subdivided the land, and in the early 1900s, and the brick servants' building was demolished in 1933. We have here today Anne Enston, who lived at St Ninians in the 1960s. It was then sold to the Crittendens in the 1970s. She described it as comfortable and solid. But St Ninians could not survive the 1970s. The National Trust was unable to prevent its demolition in 1974. This shows the position of St Ninians on the block and superimposed on the site today. There's now a commemorative plaque on what was once Point Cole, no longer a point, the bay having been filled to its north. As well as managing his wharf and bonded store, Cole was chairman of the Port Phillip Steam Navigation Company and owned or co-owned many steamers. He imported the latest steam engines and built ships. He salvaged ships in the bay, bought wrecks for scrap, and there were frequent auctions at his wharf, mainly of unwanted goods landed from ships. He was connected with several banks, chair of the Coal Mining Company, auditor of the Corporation of Melbourne for a year, and agent for Lloyd's. For a few years he devoted himself to squatting, with interest in Muckleford and Cairn Curran on the Loddon, and a station at Mount Cole near Ararat. Mount Cole was not, as you might think, named after Captain Cole, but was named by Major Mitchell in 1836. Perhaps Captain Cole bought the land because of the name. His steamship fleet needed fuel, so he investigated reports of coal at Cape Patterson. And good quality coal was mined there for a while. As a source of firewood, he bought land at Redcliffe on the Bellarine Peninsula. He established a town, St Leonard's, building a pier, and by 1858 there were 6 houses, a store and a hotel. He had ambitious plans drawn up for a substantial township with streets named after his family. Although his plan was not implemented, there are Cole and Ward streets in St Leonard's today. There is a monument to Cole on the foreshore to commemorate his involvement in the establishment of the town. He had other property interests. He bought land in Williamstown, Footscray, Frankston, Gippsland and North Melbourne. At least one house he built there still stands, at 256 Victoria Street. It was later named Osborne House. Cole threw himself into the local community, joining committees and expressing views on the key issues of the day. He joined many committees in diverse fields, including one to plan for Governor Gipp's visit to Port Phillip in 1841, and one to determine the best sites for lighthouses. And he was vice president of the Mechanics' Institute. He was an uncompromising opponent of transportation and subscribed to the Australasian Anti-Transportation League. He would also often find offer solutions to issues raised in the district. As I mentioned, he advocated cutting a deep canal to shorten the meandering Yarra River to make it accessible to larger ships and to reduce the risk of flooding, which were a frequent occurrence in the town. It was not until just before Cole's death in 1879 that Sir John Cood's report recommended such a canal. He was a strong advocate of separation from New South Wales, and in 1848 he opposed electing people to represent Port Phillip in Sydney and advocated the nomination of the Duke of Wellington and other lords in protest. The next year he was present when Governor Fitzroy was being entertained by the Foundry of Melbourne. Fitzroy expressed his regret that the prospect of separation would mean he would be officially disconnected from the district, but one cannot help but feel that he would be relieved to be rid of the complaining residents of Port Phillip. Cole offered to lease and drain a swamp in Melbourne's west. He solved the problem of supplying water for ships in Hobson's Bay by building a floating water tank that could be filled up with water from the falls and towed to the ships. He was passionate about railways. He put forward a plan for the development of railway lines to the major settlements in Victoria and argued against building roads which were simply washed away each winter. In 1863, Cole introduced sugar beet to the colony. He obtained seed from Holland and distributed it freely. He wanted to improve agriculture and advocated the establishment of agricultural training schools. He was appointed as a magistrate for the city of Melbourne and later a territorial magistrate. Once separation from New South Wales was achieved in 1851, Captain Cole was keen to take part in the first Legislative Council of Victoria. He became a candidate for the city of Melbourne, but he came last of 7 candidates, having been reluctant to campaign. However, in 1853, the seat of Gippsland became available, and Captain Cole offered himself for the vacancy and was elected. Soon after his election, he was appointed to a select committee to consider the harbour regulations, and he assisted in the framing of the Constitution Act. He remained in the Legislative Council until 1855, when he resigned to make a trip to England. In fact, he made 2 trips. He sailed on the Eagle in May 1855 with his family. These portraits were painted by John Irving of Scotland during their visit. They returned at the end of 1856 on the Royal Charter. It was this ship that 3 years later, on its return from Australia, was wrecked on the north coast of Anglesey, Wales, with the loss of 450 lives and much gold. A freak storm with hurricane-force winds from the north wrecked about 200 ships, and it became known as the Royal Charter Storm. It was the catalyst for the development of the Meteorological Office under Vice Admiral Robert Fitzroy, a Beagle fame and half-brother of Governor Charles Fitzroy. It brought in the first gale warning service in Britain to help prevent similar tragedies. After his return from his second trip to England, Cole was elected to represent the Central Province in the Upper House in 1859. He retained the seat until his death in 1879. Age and venerable appearance made him one of the most conspicuous figures in the Council's chamber. Captain Cole had his own views, and they placed him, as a rule, in opposition to the great majority of his fellow members. But he was undeterred and struggled gallantly on, despite all difficulties. He acted as the representative of the McCulloch government in the Legislative Council in the 1860s, and was made an executive councillor in 1867. Captain Cole was a strong protectionist, arguing that local industry would not grow without a tariff on imported goods. He set forth his views in a pamphlet. He took a great interest in the defences of Port Phillip, publishing a pamphlet on the subject. As a naval man, it is not surprising that he favoured ships for defence over fixed land batteries. He advocated the purchase of ironclad gunboats. At this time, Captain Cowper Coles was developing his patent design for a revolving gun turret. It was intended to be fitted to ironclad ships lying low in the water, ideal for coastal defence. HMVS Cerberus, equipped with 2 Coles turrets, was delivered to Victoria in 1871. It served in Port Phillip until 1924, when it was scuttled off Half Moon Bay, Black Rock. You can see the muzzles of the guns in the rear round turret. When Captain Cole was re-elected for the Central Province in 1860, The Age wrote, "Captain Cole appears to be one of the few wealthy men desirous of a seat in Parliament who have large, liberal, just views as to what is due to the welfare of the people, and as to what is the best and soundest policy for new countries such as ours. He comprehends the wisdom of being liberal to the working classes and allotting them their share of the natural advantages held out by a new country. He is a lucky exception to his class, and we are pleased to see him again seated in the legislature." Cole died in his house in Brighton on the 26th of April 1879, in full possession of his faculties. To the last, he continued to manifest deep interest in the affairs of the colony. On the day of his death, he listened attentively while a friend read Sir John Coote's proposal for improvements to the harbour. His love of his old naval profession never abated, and before death, he expressed a wish that he should be buried with a Union Jack around him. He was carried to the grave on a gun carriage drawn by 4 horses, the coffin draped with a Union Jack. The cortege left St Ninian's, crossed Prince's Bridge at noon, on its way to the old Melbourne cemetery, where he was buried in the family burying place, next to 4 of his children and his stepson. George Higginbotham, Chief Justice of Victoria, wrote of Captain Cole after his death. "He was always thinking of the public welfare, and was never wearied in advocating measures which he thought calculated to promote it. No politician in recent Australian history appears to present a record of purer and more sincere patriotism, or of more unselfish and benevolent political action than Captain George Ward Cole." When Cole's daughter Margaret died in 1926, his memory died out with her. None of his 7 children married, and even his grave was unmarked. A few street names and plaques at Point Cole and St Leonard's have the only lasting memory of a remarkable man.